wonderful to see you here. I originally came to the CCI because I wanted help with my tropical houseplants. And as a computer scientist, I didn't really know anything about what was going on. And then David Coombs and Bill Sutherland lured me in to build Planetary databases. And the basic thesis that Bill started with was that conservation evidence is an incredibly impactful project. And they've heroically, over the last few decades, managed to come up with around 8,500 studies by analyzing around 1.5 million papers from all over the world. However, there are over 250 million publications worldwide through history, and probably over 1 billion publications in other formats that have been recorded and reported and are not being utilized as part of this. And obviously, with the precipitous decline in nature over the last few decades, we're trying to figure out how to replicate these things as fast as possible to enhance the effectiveness of action. So first of all, how can computer science contribute towards scaling these analyses to form causal evidence more quickly? And then how do we just get a move on and have impactful action on the ground as quickly as possible? So what I'm going to do is, we've been hacking on this quite a bit. Some of the things that I'm going to show you are about 30 minutes old. So there's features here that Bill himself has not seen yet, and he got a demo at 9 in the morning. And what we've been doing is trying to close the loop around the machine learning pipeline. And for those of you who may have heard about the machine learning hype, but are not familiar with how it works, well, it's a very fast-moving field. And the basic idea is that the fuel behind machine learning is data. And the idea is that instead of forming explicit causal hypotheses, that we take a large amount of data and we infer a very large parametric space from which inferences form connections which might not be obvious to the human eye. So whereas in a normal study, we might look at, for example, 20 to 50 parameters, some of the models we're looking at use billions of parameters. They can't really be ascribed human meaning, but they can hopefully form useful inferences from that. And before you dive into machine learning, you typically do so in an iterative way. And what I'm going to show you now is the way that we iterated towards learning how machine learning might help with conservation evidence. The first thing we did was just say, how far can we get using the basic metadata available? So if you look into some of the openly available search engines, so in this case, OpenAlex, if I look for something like skinks, for example, I just learned their existence the other day. They're not skunks. I heard that there's this famous paper by Cooper in 1993, which gives you the title, but it doesn't really give you any other metadata. It gives you the authors and the year it was published. So how useful might this be towards figuring out anything about evidence without having any other data at all? So the first thing we did was we tried to cluster together using only the titles of papers, which is a very minimal amount of data, the conservation evidence in terms of how they relate to each other using openly available language models. Now, these language models work by being pre-trained on lots and lots of general data about language use across the internet. So they're not in any way specialists about conservation, but they do understand most of the world's languages that are present on the internet. And so using this, it turns out we've got a reasonable correspondence behind how some of these papers fit together. And there's some outliers here which were selected for some reason, but are not necessarily that particularly relevant, or there are different languages and so on which couldn't quite be parsed. So that's good. So we looked at these titles and we could come up with a reasonable correspondence. But then the CE project is so incredible because if you continue going run this, I can't advance. Oh, there we go. If we then continue to say, well, we've visualized the basic idea from the titles, how do we now look into the existing set of studies that we had? Because they form anchors. They're real human-labeled data sets that can improve the efficiency of the machine learning model. So at this point, you can start doing some interesting clustering where you say, well, we can actually look at the data sets and we can actually start to categorize them on the basis of a wider set of data available in the outside world. And if we start zooming in, we can ask our machine learning models to start categorizing some of these papers into broad categories. So biodiversity and conservation. If we drop into conservation, we have forest ecology, and then we have restoration ecology. And as we zoom in, we can get more and more kind of information about all these different things. And each of these represents one of the papers where green is one of the conservation evidence analyzed ones, and the others are miscellaneous ones found in the outside world over there. Now, when you do this kind of thing, the idea is to try to map things into some kind of a hierarchy. And you can actually visualize these in lots and lots of different ways. So another way to visualize these hierarchies is try to say, well, we have a whole bunch of data available from all of the papers in the world, and we have lots and lots of multidimensional connections between these things. And what conservation evidence is really trying to do is to try to figure out, well, given a cluster of some particular topic, how do we look at that particular cluster and then find relevant papers that we might have missed from the other billion papers published in the world as quickly as possible? And so this clustering immediately started to show us that if we start looking at just, and this is still using just the titles in the CE data, we can start to identify, in this particular case, this framework for understory vegetation. And you can start to see that these clusters are forming an interesting hydrologies almost between how they feed into other areas. And also you can spot areas which are entirely gray or a mixture or entirely green, which indicates that they've been very well studied by conservation evidence. So this was an encouraging step forward to try to figure out how this stuff could all kind of fit together. So then we continue this now that we've got this kind of reasonable hierarchy where we've got a set of potential papers that have been selected and also are mapping onto the existing conservation evidence frameworks. So then let's continue our adventure. At this point, we're like, okay, we need a little bit more data. The titles are not quite enough for us to infer reasonable causality. So at this point, being in Cambridge became a big advantage because we went over to the Cambridge University Press and Assessment Office and also the library. And we're lucky that we have institutional subscriptions to most of the world's major journals. So we embarked on a month or two of negotiating with the various publishers and using the fact that we're a copyright library and we have access to all of these things. And we built some bespoke infrastructure here to retrieve millions of papers and abstracts across dozens of publishers from lots of languages. And these were ranked by the previous round of things where we're trying to find potentially good papers. So we didn't want to download 250 million abstracts because we're trying to do the minimal amount of data possible to get useful inferences. Otherwise, it would be too unwieldy. So at this point, we've grabbed loads and loads of paper abstracts. We've tied them to the titles, and then we can put it into an even bigger language model. So each of these models that we're training are getting increasingly larger as the amount of data that we're putting into it also increases. So these SLMs are known as small language models. They only have a few tens of millions of parameters. This one called Llama 3, released by Meta, has 70 billion parameters and is one of the most advanced language models that we have. And at this point, we want to provide a richer interface for us to work with. So this is what we're doing now, which is a labeling interface for the CE researchers and the expert groups around the world to take a paper and essentially categorize it as quickly as they possibly can. So in this case, for example, we have a fairly classic, I assume, CE one, which is about wild bees in vineyards. But then what we can do is we can ask for the AI-generated summary of the effect of an action, what the study is measuring, what the action actually is, and if it's under human control, and then also to have a recommendation, which is the feature that Bill hasn't seen yet. And so the idea here is to take the guidelines that we've been given by CE about what makes an effective action, the sum of all the previous presentations, and then try to give a reasonable kind of baseline, and also structure it in the form required by CE by summarizing quite a complex set of abstracts. And then what the human can do is simply categorize based on the defaults of, in this case, bees, obviously, and accept them. And that human input label is tracked separately from all the machine learning inputs in order to provide what we want to see. And then this is true for all the papers involved. So this is salmon, for example. It's quite fun just learning about conservation. By looking at this, you can learn about the criteria. In this case, I learned what keystone grazers are. And again, this one is mainly being applied to crop plants. Perhaps if there's some, even though it mentions the fact that there's mammalian grazers, the actual intervention itself is relevant to fields, and therefore the categorization only pick crop plants as the input. That's my non-expert interpretation. I hope that kind of makes sense as well. And then in some cases, if we scroll down a little bit, so we have lots of multiple languages as well, because these language models have been trained on different languages, but and also the abstracts are often human translated and repeated. We can do a pretty good job of summarizing them. In this case, it explores ontogenetic circumstances, which I will seek advice on in the future, but it gives us a reasonable recommendation as well. And in some cases, it excludes them. So in this case, for example, this one is measuring the predation of really cute young tortoises, but because it's not tying it directly to a human-initiated action, then the model is deciding it doesn't meet the criteria that we've defined in CE, and therefore it should be excluded. And I'm sorry, the tortoises get rejected there as well. And the idea is that all of these things are really quite diverse and worldwide. So in this case, for example, a South American one, South African one, sorry, on plants, and we're pretty pleased with how the models are learning and getting through all of the different different things that they have to figure out in order to give reasonable baselines for humans to work from much more effectively as well. Crucially, the system is built in such a way that before anything gets promoted to the data sets, it has to go through human verification and validation in order to make sure that we don't contaminate the really valuable corpus of human-generated information with lots of machine learned noise that is effectively garbage if it hasn't been looked at by an expert in the field, because errors do happen especially in some of the edge cases of these things as well. And then where is this going to in the future? Well, it turns out that you can then have something called retrieval augmented generation, which is a way of connecting up some of these things to big global databases, such as biodiversity databases or other kind of policy databases. And then by giving it to another machine learning model, but also in this case, grabbing the entire full text of the paper. So we have terabytes of papers downloaded. This is much more complicated from a machine learning perspective because you just have a lot more data. We have terabytes of data now instead of gigabytes. But what we want to do is to generate summaries where the actual action is marked up in the paper as kind of PDF annotations, so the human can immediately see the source data and actually help with the verification. And then eventually also parse the statistical basis on which those were made by looking at the paper and then running it through, for example, the Christie tests and the other elements we've seen in order to form not an expert opinion, but certainly a statistically bounded opinion that experts can use to augment their understanding of it. Where does this all end? Is machine learning going to take over the world? The answer is no. At some point, you have to stop flogging the machine learning horse. And there are clear limits to what we can do with machine learning. And what we're doing then in order to advance replication is actually not applying machine learning to this because we've got lots and lots of data that we've learned from all this causal inferencing here. So at this point, we switch away to normal geospatial analysis, and we combine lots and lots of big data sets that we're also creating here in the CCI, along with lots of partners worldwide, to give us spatiotemporal ideas of where some of the replications we've learned from CE can be applied worldwide. So to give you a quick example of what this looks like, one of them is using IBAT to form a global biodiversity measurement, which is trying to figure out for all terrestrial species worldwide, how does converting or destroying a given piece of land shift the probability of extinctions of all those species? So it's a persistent metric that's globally comparable worldwide. In this case, for example, if you take the bush hyrax, closest living relative to the elephant, yes, Bill's nodding. Then in East Africa, what we do basically is use lots and lots of observations from biodiversity data sets, so the range data, the habitat preferences, elevation preferences, and so on, and come up with areas of habitat. But we repeat that for all 40,000 species in this data set in order to construct an enormous map, which shows us this is the live data set here. So in false color, this is showing us worldwide what the impact is. It's red for mammals, blue for birds, yellow for reptiles, and green for amphibians. So you can start to see here that as it gets dark, that's lots and lots of endemic species. And then as we head into North America here, there's lots of bird species over there. And then you can see the equatorial tropical belt, obviously, where lots of the biodiversity is. But this gives us a really detailed map for processing conventional data of potential areas worldwide where we might want to have a go at applying some of the conservation evidence details that we've seen as well. And so by connecting the causality data to the normal geospatial conservation data, you form a powerful connective tissue where you use machine learning to generate hypotheses, and then you can then connect it up in order to further the aims that you have. So another example is then using this, we're then trying to use it to analyze the impact of human food consumption on extinctions, so tying it back to the reason for the land use pressures in the first place. And you can start to see here that ruminant meat, for example, has an enormously outsized effect, as many here have posited. But we can also tie it to supply chain data worldwide from the TRACE initiative of the Stockholm Environmental Institute, and then figure out that some countries have lots and lots of domestic consumption and biodiversity damage. But in the UK, for example, lots of our ruminant meat is imported, and therefore we're outsourcing our land use biodiversity damage as well. So the question really becomes, how do we measure comparably worldwide the value of an intervention? And you're starting to see how we can defensively connect up data sets in order to kind of pull this off. And all of this, luckily for me, requires lots of computing and lots of computer science. But luckily we have that bit under control. We're building infrastructure here that we dub planetary computing, which tries to tie together lots and lots of the data sets and the inferences that you've seen here, tries to build it in a way that avoids value capture by any one organization. So this has to be distributed worldwide across the various organizations and countries involved. But we deal with systematically ingesting, transforming the data, analyzing it, and publishing it for the long term, and also make sure that we have traceability and explainability and incremental computations so we can explore things built into the fabric of this thing as well. And so by putting all these pieces together, I'm hopeful that computer science can do our part to help accelerate all the incredibly impressive and hard work that I've seen this morning, this afternoon, and also throughout my years here. And I'm looking forward to listening, learning, and understanding how we can contribute more to the kind of problems that you're solving on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Anil. That was a really fascinating run through eruptions. I feel I understand a little bit more. I know it really is lunch now, but I think we've just got to, if anyone's got a couple of burning questions, I'm actually going to say, if anybody's got any burning questions for our last few speakers, because they got off pretty lightly with the question side, but any question for Anil or the other speakers? Yes.
Beautiful map colours of the different species.
Oh, yes.
Is that available?
It's in the very, very last stage of review at a journal, so it will be openly available. We have a website called Quantify.earth, and we're putting all of them on an interactive map, and you can download the geotips as well.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Yes, right at the back.
Anil, an awful lot of your initial analysis was just based on titles of publications, irrespective of the result. Well, the previous speaker, his question was, is there a standard way I could record my results? Can you imagine a world where we don't need paper publication at all, where you and your science can just go straight to standardized databases and get what you want and need?
Yeah. So when it comes to standardization, usually it's more important to think about interoperability rather than the specific format, because you want to be able to translate between evolving formats as the years go on. So that's actually how the internet works. We don't specify how one particular router works. We specify how they talk to each other. And then there's 100 billion talking to each other. And we have lots of different implementations as well. So the same intuition holds for why were titles so effective. And that's because when you write a big paper, you have a big budget. So you don't really need to think about every word, do you? Well, unless you're against deadline. But then when it comes to the abstract, you're like, how do I squeeze these 12 pages into one paragraph? And then the title is every word matters. And, especially if it's a high profile one. So really these represent a density of human thought, how much effort went into structuring them and really getting the message across as a hierarchy. And so that essence is what is being learned from machine learning here. So similarly, if we build these biodiversity databases, you got to think, how do you maximize the density of thought and care that's been put into it? And then we can figure out how to interpret it through all of these, machine learning things pretty straightforwardly, I think. But really it's about recording the heart of it, and the truth of it, the evidence behind what that is. So in the case of the previous talk, how do we know, for example, that these camera traps were real pictures taken at a real time and not AI-generated pictures generated for the purpose of, satisfying some scheme? You can imagine all this is being used maliciously as well. So we have to make sure that we maintain our evidence base digitally as well. So we have to sign things, make sure that AI generation doesn't get out of control, so we know what's real and what's not. And then the rest, I think, can be helped by just normal computer science processing as well.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Just a quick cross-cutting observation. It's been such a fascinating morning, but it struck me that a lot of our discussion has been framed in terms of more evidence, better evidence, more robust evidence, as if it was a quantity. Whereas we began this morning with Teresa and others, picking up the fact that in many of the situations we're dealing with in conservation, we've got complex systems which are open to different values, plural priorities about what that system is delivering. Different species, livelihoods versus habitats, etc. And we've heard rather less about the kinds of methods that are not about balancing out or aggregating, but actually are about making explicit those differences. So the kinds of things that some of the earlier work I did with colleagues in the STEP Centre we'd be looking at are things like multi-criteria mapping, sensitivity analysis, deliberative mapping, Q method, etc., etc. One could go on. They're quantitative as well as qualitative. You can do it in a participatory way. What suddenly struck me about this AI discussion is that actually machine learning and the way it generates clusters could precisely do that, is precisely open to those different framings and different values. And you could actually train your models to pick up on those differences. And then you've got a very different situation for decision makers who are not just working on what is the evidence, but they're saying, what are the particular clusters of ideas in papers, or take a community-based approach that come through participatory mapping or digital storytelling or whatever your method. But you're left with the same situation where you're deliberating amongst different framings and priorities. And I think there is a frontier in conservation evidence which is about this deliberative work, and it's very exciting to see that one can do it not just in conventional qualitative social science modes, which is kind of where I come from, but actually to make use of planetary computing tools as well. So I wanted to thank Anil, but just flag that I think this is where some of the discussion needs to be going.
I entirely agree with that, but a note of caution though. These machine learning models reinforce bias, and it is appalling how the inequity in data collection. So we've been training an experimental map which shows the bias inherent in data. So what the map shows you is that what is the areas in the world where if you were to gather some data, it has the highest likelihood of giving us new insights, which is, all the data deficient places in the world, right? And this is all in the global south. I mean, it's such a depressing map. So we really, really do, I think, before we take the risk of machine learning further reinforcing our decision-making as a society, I think we really need to cure this kind of data equity thing systematically over the next few years. So,
brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I'm